Welcome back, everyone, to another deep dive where we like to pick a topic and really get into the weeds a bit. And today we are diving headfirst into Japanese particles.
Yeah, these are those tiny but mighty elements of the Japanese language that can make or break your understanding.
It's true, they're so small, but they pack such a punch. And I feel like they can be one of the trickiest things for language learners to wrap their heads around.
Absolutely. They really are. And once you get them, they unlock a whole new level of fluency and cultural understanding, too.
It's like you're cracking a code, almost, you know? Like, you start seeing how these particles shape the meaning in ways that we just don't really have a parallel for in English.
Exactly, yeah.
So we've got some really interesting material to work with today, and I'm kind of excited to see what we uncover. Where do we even begin? Like, what are some of the most common misunderstandings that you've encountered about particles?
Well, one of the biggest ones is that people try to find direct English equivalents for the particles, which, you know, a lot of times just isn't the case. And that can lead to some pretty clunky translations and misunderstandings.
Yeah, for sure.
Like if you take the particle wa, for example.
Yeah.
You know, a lot of times it's introduced as the subject marker,
Right.
but it has so much more nuance than that.
Can you give us an example maybe of how that nuance kind of plays out in an actual sentence?
Yeah, so let's say we have the sentences neko ga tapeta and neko wa tapeta.
Mm-hmm.
So both of these can be translated as the cat ate,
Right, right.
but the emphasis is different.
Okay.
So in the first sentence, what got, the focus is really more on the action of eating. Like we're answering the question, who ate?
Mm-hmm.
But in the second sentence with wa, we're kind of shifting the focus to the cat itself.
Okay.
Maybe like introducing it as the topic of the conversation. It's sort of like saying, speaking of the cat, it ate.
Oh, that's a good way to put it. Yeah. Okay, so wa sets the stage, and then ga kind of shines the spotlight.
Hmm?
I like that. I'm starting to see how those little like subtle shifts can really change the whole meaning.
Totally. Yeah.
It's like learning a whole new way of thinking almost.
It is. And this is why like mastering those particles is so important for fluency.
Yeah.
You're not just like translating words, you're conveying all these subtle shades of meaning
Yeah.
and emphasis and even cultural understanding.
It seems like particles act as a bridge almost between grammar and like the actual culture itself.
They do. They do. In fact, the text even mentioned the particles kashira and kana. They both express uncertainty.
Okay.
But kashira is considered to be more feminine. And so even with these like really seemingly simple grammatical elements, you can see how they're intertwined with like cultural norms
Yeah, wow.
surrounding gender and communication styles.
That's fascinating. Okay, so I think it's interesting that we're talking about particles as these like suffixes or short words that come after the word they modify. And we've mentioned that there are 8 main types. Can you give us a quick rundown of those before we get into some more specific examples?
Sure. So you have case markers, which indicate the relationship between words in a sentence, kind of like prepositions do in English.
Right, okay.
You have sentence-ending particles, which add flavor and emotion, like a question mark or an exclamation point.
Okay.
And then you've got your conjunctive particles, and those act like conjunctions in English, you know, linking sentences and clauses together.
Okay, so we've got the building blocks, we've got the punctuation, and then we've got like the glue that holds it all together.
Exactly.
What are some of the other types that we should be aware of?
Well, you've also got adverbial particles, and those modify verbs and adjectives and even like whole sentences. And then there are ada, interjectory particles, and those express like emotions or reactions like surprise or doubt. And then we've got emphatic particles that add emphasis or like highlight a specific part of a sentence.
Wow, there's a lot. It's amazing how these little tiny elements can completely, you know, change a sentence.
Yeah, they're small but mighty, right?
Totally.
They each have a very specific role to play in like constructing natural sounding Japanese and, you know, making sure that the speaker's intended meaning really comes across.
It's really cool. Okay, I want to get into some specific examples from the text because I feel like that's always super helpful.
Yeah.
What are some that you thought were especially insightful or intriguing?
Well, the particle bakari comes to mind.
Yeah.
It's a good one.
It's a really good one. And that one, I think the text said, is often used to kind of express the idea of something being full of or only something else.
Right, exactly.
And they gave the example, Tokyo is just full of people.
Yeah.
Using bakari, which I thought was so perfect because
Yeah.
it really gets that feeling of like the crowds
It does,
and just like the energy of Tokyo being like a very full place.
Yeah, and it's not just a literal translation, right? Like, it's
Yeah.
not just saying that there are a lot of people. It's that feeling of being like almost overwhelmed by
Right, exactly.
the sheer number of people.
Yeah, it adds that extra layer of emotion to it.
Yeah, totally.
I like that. What else? What other ones kind of jumped out at you?
Made is another really good one.
Okay, yeah.
Because, a lot of times learners will encounter that as until
Right.
in terms of time.
Yeah.
But it can also mean as far as when you're talking about like a distance.
Oh, that's right. Yeah, and they gave that example of the train goes as far as Shimonoseki.
Exactly.
Which really clearly shows like that's the destination. That's the furthest point that the train is going to.
Yeah, and it's interesting because like both of those meanings kind of have that concept of a limit, right? Oh, that's true, yeah.
Whether it's a limit in time or a limit in space.
It's amazing how one little particle can have these like multifaceted...
It is. It
I
is.
guess.
They're very evocative in a way.
Yeah, it's like they each tell a story almost.
That's a great way to put it. Yeah, yeah. And speaking of story or like, emphasizing something,
Okay.
Koso is a really interesting one.
Okay.
Because that one really emphasizes like what came before it.
Okay.
And it adds a sense of like drama or importance to it.
Oh, I like that one. It's like saying, this is the important part.
Right.
Pay attention. The example I think they gave was, today I'm going to do it.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Which I thought was interesting because...
Changes the whole tone, right?
It does, yeah. You can almost hear like the determination in the speaker's voice.
Exactly.
Like it adds that extra oomph to it.
Yeah. And it's cool because it's like, it's not just, the literal meaning of the words. It's like that extra layer of emotion.
Yeah. It's like particles can almost influence how you interpret the speaker's emotions or intentions almost.
Yeah, for sure.
Like they add the soundtrack to the conversation.
I like that. That's a good analogy.
And they kind of set the mood. This has been so eye-opening. I feel like I'm seeing Japanese in a whole new light.
Yeah.
Are there any other particles from the text that you think are worth kind of digging into?
Let's see. The text mentioned manamon, and that one is interesting because it doesn't really have like a direct English equivalent.
Oh, really?
Yeah. It's one of those ones that's very much like a Japanese thing.
Okay.
It's often used at the end of sentences and typically by women to add a sense of like casualness or even a little bit of cheekiness to what they're saying.
Oh, I love that. It's like the linguistic equivalent of like a wink or something.
Exactly. Yeah, it adds a lot of personality to the language.
Yeah, and it just shows, again, how these particles allow for these subtle nuances of expression.
They do, yeah.
That are so hard to translate.
They are.
But really just make the language so much richer, I feel like.
Yeah.
It's like, those little unspoken things that you just kind of pick up on when you've been around a language long enough.
Right, exactly.
And now we're learning how to like actually use them intentionally.
It's like you're getting to the heart of how the language actually works.
Totally, yeah. So for our listeners out there who are like, okay, this is awesome, I want to like apply this to my Japanese learning, what are some key takeaways that you would say are important?
I would say approach particles with a sense of curiosity.
Yeah.
Have fun with it. Don't be afraid to experiment.
For sure.
Make mistakes.
That's how we learn, right?
Exactly. Exactly. And remember that like context is key.
Okay.
Pay attention to how these particles are being used in different situations with different speakers in different forms of media. And the more you expose yourself to like authentic Japanese, the more intuitive it'll become.
It's like you're training your ear almost to hear the differences.
Exactly, yeah.
Awesome. Well, this has been so fun. I feel like I've learned so much about particles today, and I hope our listeners did too.
Me too, yeah. It's always fun to kind of dive into these like nitty-gritty details.
It is. It's so fun, and I always learn new things when we do these deep dives, so
Me too.
it's really cool. Well, to our listeners, thank you for joining us on this journey into the world of Japanese particles. Hopefully now you're not so intimidated by them, and you can appreciate them for the amazing little tools that they are. And we'll see you next time for another deep dive.